Hey everybody, I hope you're all doing well out there. Happy New Year! I wanted to kick off 2022 by talking about drums. I haven't spent nearly enough time harping about their importance in a mix and how, as guitar players, we can benefit significantly by spending more time on our drums. So, let's jump into Studio One, and for the love of drums, let's hear some tones. All right, so now we're in Studio One. Let's take a listen to these drums. I've got a MIDI file here, and we'll use this to start our track off. All right, nothing too out of the ordinary there. I want to talk about this drum set though. So I'm using the Metal Machine Easy Drummer expansion, and I build that on top of a foundation of the Metal Machinery Superior Drummer expansion. Now, these are complementary to one another. They're both produced by Andy Sneap. They feature John Tempesta on drums, and as far as I understand, they're from the same session. The difference is that the Metal Machine Easy Drummer expansion is far fewer of the microphones than that are provided in this Superior Drummer expansion pack. So what I did was I just simply built my own kit with one on top of the other. I start out with the Metal Machinery expansion pack, and then I stack every one of the instruments from the Metal Machine Easy Drummer expansion. So you'll see right here, there's actually two kicks being played at the same time, two snares at the same time, and the same for the toms. The cymbals all come from the Metal Machinery Superior Drummer expansion, and the reason is that there's much more microphones, more takes, and I think it does a much better job of picking up the sound of cymbals and the room. You'll notice that I remove all of the effects, including the compressors, equalizers, and whatnot. I'm going to be using my Universal Audio Apollo and my UAD plugins for all of the processing. I want that all to be done with hardware and DSP. I don't want my computer to be using that CPU processing power. I can use that for other things. What I will keep though is Superior Drummer's panning. So you'll see for the overheads and any of the stereo tracks here, there's panning going on, and I'm going to maintain that. Now, what I do is I send, first of all, I group my instruments. So you'll notice here, I've got a few tracks, just 6 right here, of the kick. And then I group those together and send those as their own output for send 1 and 2 into Superior Drummer. I do the same thing for the snares, and then I do the same thing for toms, overheads, and ambient mics. So you'll see I feed out of Superior Drummer going into Studio One. Now I do that because I'm going to be processing every instrument a bit differently. How I go about that is I send every one of these instruments to its own bus. So the kick has its own kick bus, the snare has its own bus, toms, overhead, and ambient, all with their own bus. I do this because I want the kick, the snare, and the ambient mics to all be processed in mono, which you can see here. And I want to keep the toms and the overheads in stereo. The reason is for their positional relationship in the drum kit. All right, so that is how I go from Superior Drummer into Studio One. Now, in terms of processing, the overall goal here is that I want to take this very pristine sounding kit, which is kind of light sounding, and I want to beef it up. I want to give it weight, texture, drive, and grit. And I'm going to do that by adding an EQ, compressors, some gain staging, and whatnot. So let's take a listen once again to the sound of the kit, and I'll solo the kick, and then we'll move into what the processing for the kick is. Now, sounds just like the beater on the drum head and a very close mic. I'm not getting much of the body. I'd like more body and less of the attack. So here's how I process that. It's subtle, but it's there. And the idea is that's all I need, because as I go through all of the processing and eventually send this into a drum bus, it's going to continue to build weight. So let's listen to the snare, because I'm going to be doing a very similar process there for the snare. This is the snare without processing. Now, sometimes I'll set up my snare to have like a gated reverb, and I'll show you what that process sounds like. For this track, we'll keep it on. All right, and you'll notice I keep some of this panned to the right in this for this snare reverb. So that's how we process the kick and the snare. Um, for the toms, I have a process, just the EQ that's very similar to what I'm doing with the the kick, where I'm rolling off some of the high end and I'm maintaining some of the body. So let's listen to that real quick. There's not that many toms in this is beat, so it might be. Yeah, we've got very few toms, but they are there. At any rate, let's move on. It's a very similar process for the toms as the kick. All right, so for the overheads, um, let's talk about what's going on with the overheads. I keep just the high end on these overheads. So I'm going to be filtering out the majority of the body. Let's hear what these sound like soloed. You can actually hear some of the snare in the overhead. For this track, I'm going to remove that, and that's what this process looks like. All right. So we've taken out most of the body with this high pass filter, and now we're going to boost some of the high end. Here's without. All right, so that's how I process the overheads. And the ambient mic, I'm going to drive that quite a bit. I'm going to filter out a lot of the high end and some of the low end, and I'm really going to push that. Let's hear what it sounds like before processing. Actually, I'm going to bring this up so you can hear it a little bit better. I'll eventually lower it in the mix, but for processing purposes, let's hear how it sounds original. It's very lively, right room. There's the filter. Now we're going to drive it. And like I said, this is not going to be the most prominent bus in the mix, but having this body and being pushed like this almost acts as like parallel compression. And I like the way that it sounds in the kit. So that's how I process the individual pieces of the kit. Now let's actually listen to what the kit sounds like processed. And here's the original. Hear how it sounds a lot more polite in the original, and how we've dirtied it up and given it a lot of character in the processed version. This is going to be a track that has a heavier bass, and a driving bass and some heavy distorted guitars on top of it. So I didn't want the drums to be very pristine sounding. I want them to match the rest of the instruments, and I want to give it that flavor of, an analog signal process, and maybe being blasted out through some speakers, maybe in a practice room or live or something like that. I want it to be driven. That's not all the processing that we're doing. We're going to send each of these buses to one final drum bus, and that's where the final part of the drum processing happens. What we're going to be doing is adding more EQ, some emulation of tubes, and we're going to send it to a Studer tape machine. I'll turn every one of these pieces on in succession so you can hear how it sounds from unprocessed to processed to final. We go from this original, which is very weak sounding to me, to this. All right, so that's how I've been processing drums recently. I hope this is helpful. Well, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found that helpful and maybe even inspired you to take a look at how you're processing your drums. Now, it wouldn't be entirely fair to talk about drums without exploring their low frequency rumbling brethren, the bass. Tune in next video for that. And until next time, take care.